Well, thank you so much, both Emily and Melody, for inviting me to come talk about HR realities in the time of COVID. I don't know about you, but the last 3 months for me has felt like 3 years. And so there has been a tremendous amount of change. There's been a tremendous amount of information, especially for HR professionals to get ramped up quickly on new legislation. I mean, can you say FFCRA, CARES Act, PPP? We've learned a whole new host of acronyms as if the HR world didn't have enough acronyms. So, with all of that, I'm happy to share with you some things that we've learned, some things that we are continuing to learn as we help employers kind of navigate through this time. So, I'll tell you about 3 months ago, where I work at MRA, we have a hotline where employers can come and ask questions. And, on a really good, busy day, we'd field over 100 calls, no problem. We were fielding over 500 calls per day. And it was just a testament of how fast and furious things were coming at us. And at the same time, we weren't receiving all the guidance that we needed to kind of navigate through all that. So it was very trying. And I applaud and appreciate all HR professionals and employers that were able to get through all of that. It was a difficult time, but we're starting to kind of see some leveling off. We're starting to see the conversation kind of turn more towards workforce and workplace recovery and what employers are doing right now to either bring people back, or if people have been at work at this time, how do you integrate kind of ramping up the workload. So I'm going to share with you a few things today. And again, as Emily mentioned, if you have questions along the way, we may stop and take them as they come, or we may do them at the very end. But either way, if there's something on your mind, let us know, and we'd be happy to tackle that. So, as mentioned, I work for MRA. I am an HR director there, but I also oversee our content strategies. So the things that we publish or the things that we create to help employers with their HR needs, those are things that I'm in charge of. And so what's really unique about that vantage point is it allows me to hear a lot of what members are dealing with, and allows me to help create, if it's resource guides or checklists, because every HR person I know loves a checklist, or a sample policy or anything like that. We have those available. And so at the end of today's presentation, I will just share with you some resources and information that are available to all of you at your fingertips, and where you can find those. So hopefully they help. I don't know about you, but I find that it's easier to react to something versus having to create something from scratch. So hopefully some of the resources that we'll make available to you are helpful to just kind of get you started if you need a place for that. Oh, I've also put my contact information. So after today, let's say you have a question that comes up and you thought, oh, I wish I could have asked Linnell that at the time. Please just reach out to me and let me know. I'd be happy to help. So my contact information is there, and then you'll get a copy of these slides as well. So really what we want to cover today, generally speaking, I want to talk about the things that are on employers' minds right now. And so while I would have said 3 months ago, a lot was questions on the different kind of legislative things that were popping up. Right now, we're kind of seeing more questions on just effectively communicating to employees. There's still a lot of uncertainty, and so it becomes tough for employers to kind of understand where their employees are at, and what's either making them uncertain about either coming back to work or maybe fearful of coming back to work, those kinds of things. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that, and just some organizational strategies that are going to kind of focus on employee well-being. We're certainly seeing that come up more. And then also the idea of policies that you're putting in place now, either in response to what the last 3 months have been like, or possibly ones that you've decided you're going to take and extend further. So just kind of want to give you some things to think about as you make policy changes, whether you want them to be temporary or permanent. And then finally, like I mentioned before, there's some resources and things that we've created and made available. So if you want to get started on a sample policy, let's say, or need a checklist or a sign off acknowledgement or something that you can have that gives you some documentation of either conversations you've had or employees sign off on the policies, those kinds of things, that's available for you. So we've done we being MRA, we've done some surveying of employers in the last couple months actually, and trying to kind of see where their mindset is at. And you could see from the screen that in terms of financial viability or business operations or even HR, how concerned are they? And you'll kind of see from the slide that certainly from an HR standpoint, there's definitely some concern, whether that be slightly to moderately, but there's just some concerns about how to best navigate workforce planning or policy changes, or like I mentioned, kind of some of the fears or the concerns that employees might have in the workplace. So what some of the key actions for organizations to take, and I'll say this probably 5,000 times, I don't know, in the next hour, but communicate is a definitely a best practice. And then being an HR practitioner for 2 decades, I will say document is probably my second thing. But certainly for organizations who are on the path to recovery, are making choices about bringing employees back to work or ramping up their workforce, the best thing to do is be in constant communication with employees about what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it's going to affect them, what the time frame is, all those kinds of things. And recognize that you're going to have employees that are kind of on that whole spectrum of how much information is, too much. And I would say to employers, don't worry so much about that. You're going to want to communicate as much as possible. For folks who just kind of want the bottom line, just give me the last thing that I need, they'll be able to filter out all that information and get what they need. So I'm a big proponent of sharing more versus sharing less. If a person is just kind of a bottom line kind of person, then I'll say maybe as an organization, you can decide to put a one pager together of all the things that the organization is doing for those folks who like that quick hit, but then also put a longer FAQ together, maybe 10 pages worth, for those folks who really want the nitty gritty of absolutely everything that's been going on. What are you doing now? What are you doing in the future? So that way you hit all the realms of how people want to take in information. And, so make that written, make that visual. I've seen a variety of different things employers are doing, videos, um, you know, podcast chats, FAQs, infographics, all those kinds of things. Too much is not too much, if that makes sense. So definitely have a plan and kind of focus your plan on and communicating that focus on a couple different things. One is I've seen a lot of organizations put together specifically a return to work plan. And that will detail out how people maybe are coming back into the workplace if they've been working remote. So whether that's staggered shifts or whether that is alternate shifts, or whether that is a plan for if there's a shared space that people work in, how are they going to navigate that? Not only, that piece of it, but also, what's it going to look like when you come back to work? Where will there be temperature screenings or mask requirements, or only, 5 people in the break room at a time? Those kinds of things. So I've seen those kinds of plans being put together, along with organizations putting a business plan, because certainly what's happened lately and with the economy and the economic viability, it may have caused employers and organizations to kind of shift their model and their business plan. Maybe they are not doing a certain area, product, service, or function that they used to as much, or maybe they're getting into a new one because of what's happened in the last 3 months. So communicating some kind of business plan so that it's future focused, because a lot of what employees want to hear right now is like, what's the future going to be like? There's a lot of uncertainty about job security, so I think that's really important to communicate. And then also having this HR plan, which we're going to talk about a little bit more when we talk about policies, but definitely having a plan for what the expectations are for employees at work, as well as thinking about workforce planning ahead. How many individuals do you really need on certain shifts? And can certain work really now be done remote? Because I'll tell you, a lot of employers in the past thought, oh, this would never work to have these kinds of positions remote. Now they've seen in the last 3 months, what do you know? It actually works. So you're seeing a different kind of shift in thinking and assessing whether some aspects or whole jobs entirely could actually be continuously done remote. And then the last thing would be communicating a well-being plan. I think a lot of what we're hearing now is related to kind of mental health concerns and focus. So really being concerned and compassionate about individuals and how they're feeling and how they're doing right now. And then also from a financial stability standpoint, a lot of employers are getting more questions from employees about how to handle their finances, or maybe they got behind, or maybe they want to take a loan out on their 401k just to try to get caught back up. So they just need help in navigating some financial aspects. So I would say some of the strategies is continue to have your listening sessions. I think most, if not all, employers had some kind of leader listening sessions to hear straight from the employees what was on their mind, and the leaders, being able to share what they knew at the time. So don't stop those. I would say continue those, and ask questions in maybe like a quick pulse survey. So I'm not talking something super in depth, although you can definitely do that as well, and I would encourage that. But if you needed some quick hit information of just 3 or 4 questions to ask and continuously ask employees: how are things going? What's your biggest concern? What would you like answered that you don't feel like you've gotten answered? Because now is not the time to back off on any kind of communication. I think we're going to need this for quite a while. There's still a lot out there that is uncertain. So when you communicate new policies, I really recommend always explaining what's the rationale behind it, like why are you doing it, and then what are the expectations going forward, so employees know for sure, okay, well, if I behave this way or behave that way, like I know what the consequences are, and I know what's expected of me. So I think those are really, really important as we can continue to communicate. So I would say from an HR standpoint, a lot of what we're seeing is like kind of this future state of work. And so many professionals that I'm talking to are assessing and continuing to reassess whether remote work options should continue. And also looking at some of their other policies, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but then also reviewing the jobs that can or should be done from home for the time being. Maybe it's not a permanent thing, but maybe it is for the rest of the summer or the rest of this year. So there's differing, schools of thought on that. And really it comes down to, I think, the culture of your organization. I've heard from some employers that say, it's just not our culture to have everybody remote. That's just not our vibe. That's not how we work well together. We've got to be, um, shoulder to shoulder, and that's how we're most creative. And someone could argue, but I'm really creative remotely. And again, it just comes down to philosophy and culture, so it is going to be different based on different employers. And so just, I would say, from a flexibility and accommodation standpoint, be open-minded about how that can work, how best it can work, how productive people can be, and that kind of thing. I know I've heard some comments about individuals or employers will say, well, some individuals, I think might be taking advantage of that. And we all know in the HR world, I mean, sure, that happens one or two times out of 100, but it's one or two times out of 100. It just sticks in our head because it's like, kind of aggravating when you feel someone might be taking advantage. But for the most part, I found that many employers are finding this to be workable or doable, or something they actually think is more productive and will continue doing for the future state. So when we talk about newer updated policies, here are some of the things that when we surveyed folks, we asked, well, what are the ones that you're kind of looking at? What do you think you might be changing, modifying, creating new? And so you'll see on the slide, much of it obviously makes sense where it talks about social distancing or cleanliness or sanitation, hygiene kinds of things, and certainly following the CDC guidelines when it comes to that, personal protective equipment, or things that just will help minimize the spread of virus. So that's one that you're going to see a lot of kind of newer policies on, maybe temperature screenings or mask coverings as well. But then people are trying to decide how to put together a policy around remote work, business and or personal travel. Certainly in the very beginning, or about 3 months ago, personal travel was something that came up a lot. So there we were seeing kind of hotbeds of activity in certain cities. So it made sense that someone would want to know, well, where did you travel, and how are you, when are you coming back? And we may need to quarantine you. Now employers are wondering, well, it's the summer, people still have a lot of vacation and PTO to burn because they probably may or may not have been doing it the last few months. May want to take vacation. They may be leaving the state. Do I ask them to tell me what their plans are? Do I ask them to self quarantine when they come back? So those are all individual assessments that employers need to make and take and talk about and figure out what's going to be the best policy, certainly in the current situation. So with that in mind, here's some things that I want you to kind of think about and consider, whether you're going to make a policy temporary or possibly permanent. Right now, I mean, here's some questions to think and consider. What's working? What is actually working? So if it's a remote work situation, has it been working? And with that, I'd even say, assess and evaluate. Maybe it hasn't been working perfectly, but also keep in mind that most individuals who went home to work also had maybe a spouse or a partner or children or a dog, right there kind of like around them. And that's not your typical remote work situation, but certainly was our current reality based on the last 3 months. So maybe as things start to quote unquote normalize a little bit, maybe the remote working situation is something you reassess, or you could always say, let's take a look at it in the next 3 months and evaluate. You don't have to put yourself in a situation where you have to make a guarantee of it forever. So always reassess and see what's working. What fits your culture? Definitely. So I kind of mentioned that before with the remote work situation. What's financially doable? So when you're looking at policies that might be related to extending paid leaves of absences, maybe beyond what the government is requiring, or maybe you're a large enough organization that you didn't qualify for the Families First Act, but you decided, I'm going to pay for personal time off for individuals for a certain amount of time. What's your policy going to be later on, let's say in the fall or winter, if individuals get sick again, or maybe there's mini spikes that happen? What is your organization going to do? Are they going to still implement that? What's financially doable? How will you make that work? So just be thinking through and asking all these questions and getting all the stakeholder opinions in mind so that you're really kind of making that best decision. Also think about, what does each state require? So that's another interesting thing that you're going to find in different states, especially when they're coming back with return to work guidelines or expectations. There's some states that are looking at putting specific wording right in their executive orders that say, you know, you must have employees sign off on something, or you must have them wear a mask, or you must have them work at home if they can work at home. Oftentimes, what I've seen in the state requirements is that it's more like it's strongly encouraged or um, recommended. But some states, just to be aware of, might be a little bit stronger in their language, and they might say, we expect, or employers must do this. So I'd just be careful and just be aware that each state might have some different requirements. Now, I'll tell you, I've also been asked, are they really going to go around and police all that? Well, I'm sure they don't have capacity, but here's what's going to happen is that the first complaint or concern or incident of an employee saying, hey, my employer didn't take care of me, they're going to ask the question, well, did you, have them, did you communicate to him? Did you have him sign off? Did you, you know, do all these kind of recommended safety measures? And if your answer is, well, no, 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 and no, that's going to be a big problem. So that's, I think, your best bet is to make sure that you have done your due diligence and figuring out what you need to do. And then finally, really what's best for the employees and the organization. And that's really, and I put in there because it's really a collaborative thing to figure out is obviously the policy has to make sense for the organization, but right now for employees, the most important thing you want to do is get them back to work and get them productive and successful and contributing. And so you want to keep them engaged. You want to keep retaining them, right? So that they don't leave. So you really want to balance what is going to be good to be as flexible and as accommodating as you possibly can, but at the same time understand, of course, you need to run a business. So I would say overall, I mean, these are the kinds of challenges that HR folks are dealing with, have been talking about. And so a lot of it is trying to kind of navigate, what does our new kind of normal look like in our workspace, in our workplace, in our policies, in our procedures? How do we plan for ahead for the future? I know I've had some HR folks that do need to hire. They need staff, and they're finding that the environment's a little different out there. Candidates are asking more questions or different questions than they asked before. They're asking things like, well, how safe is your environment? Well, what are you doing to ensure that if someone gets sick, that everyone else is safe? And these are questions that not normally, we would have been asked before, but we're being asked now. Or how viable is your business? Because if I'm going to take a job here, I want to know you're still going to be around in 5 years. So those kinds of things. And also communicating just difficult decisions in general, whether there may be a downturn in business and you have to lay off someone permanently, or perhaps because for cost-cutting measures, your organization's decided we're not going to give merit increases this year, or we're going to freeze or even lower pay for a certain amount of time. Those are tough conversations to have. And certainly when it's approached with, again, the rationale and the expectations and with compassion, most employees will be willing to accept that, but it's still going to be really difficult. And they're really going to want to understand why these decisions are being made and how it affects them. So overall, Like never before, we've really had to kind of navigate through managing change and figuring out how to help our employees through this. So if you are having employees that are kind of pushing back, or they're fearful, or they're saying, I'm not going to do it that way, I'm going to go back to doing it the way I always have been doing, that's always a clue for us in HR to um, to assess how well we communicated what's in it for them, or how well we communicated why this is a safety practice and measure for them, or just communicating in general what it is that we expect them to do. So that's a constant thing we are doing every day. So that, along with handling mental health concerns, which I'll talk about in the next slide as well. But then I mentioned also keeping employees engaged. So what's our role? With mental health, obviously, this is a top focus for employers. Not that it wasn't before, but it is certainly one now. And this kind of past notion of, just leave your personal issues at the door, that is completely gone. If it wasn't gone before, obviously, individuals bring their whole selves to work. And so we need to be cognizant of how that's affecting their work. And so some of the things that we can do in terms of maybe addressing the stigma of mental health is really partnering with a strong employee assistance program. If you don't have one, which most employers do, but I would say I found that they may have an EAP, but they kind of use them as that's that 1-800 number, that confidential resource that you can call if you have any, concerns or issues. But they haven't gone the step farther to actually partner with their EAP, to get their consultant or their liaison on the phone and say, we want to do more in our organization. We want to partner with you, bring you in for educational sessions, or have you work proactively with us on a strategy that will really focus on the totality of an employee's well-being. Because at the end of the day, we want them to feel like they can come to work and be fully productive. And in order to do that, we know we have to balance everything that's maybe going on, and help give them support and resources. So what I thought I'd do next is kind of go through a couple of these questions that we've been getting related to our hotline, and what kind of responses that we've been giving as well. So overall, I'd say a lot of employers are putting plans in place to bring their employees back to the work site, but some of what they're getting is a lot of pushback that employees don't want to come back to work. And what should employers do? And in that situation, I really encourage the HR professional to go back and to get curious and ask questions as to why. There's a lot and a whole host of reasons out there as to why an individual may not want to come back to work. And we really have to pick apart each one and do individual assessments on each one. There's no one size fits all approach. One person might say, well, I don't want to come back because I'm fearful. Another person will say, well, I don't want to come back because I'm taking care of my elderly mother at home. Another is taking care of my children who are still possibly in school. Or they may say, well, I've heard I'm kind of in this high risk category, I guess I probably shouldn't come in. Or, I mean, we've heard a lot of things. Maybe they don't want to come back to work because they've been off of work and maybe are getting unemployment. And while not as typical, but in some situations, maybe have been getting more in unemployment than they normally would. These are tough. I get it. It's all understandable. These are real concerns. And employees want to know that they're heard, and they want to know that you're listening and that you're thinking through all the different possible scenarios. So whether that be, what are your options for leaves of absences? What are your options for, staggering work? What are your options for remote work? What are your options for these types of accommodations? how well have you communicated your safety plan, so that when the person says they're fearful, you could say, well, we've done all these things to mitigate risk. Um, but understanding that sometimes there may be other issues going on, mental health perhaps, that maybe they're dealing with a serious condition that would qualify as a disability. And then in that case, as employers, we have an obligation to accommodate. So there's so many of these things that kind of like rattle around. And sometimes it's hard to kind of keep your head straight of like, what am I not thinking about? What should I be considering? So in those situations, I really encourage, if you have, other folks on your HR team or other peers you can reach out to, or other experts like we have on the call that you can reach out to, or your legal counsel, just ensure that you have all the information that you need to make the best decision. So another thing kind of related to one of the scenarios I just mentioned is, what if an employee says, well, they've been working remote, they've had school children at home. Well, now, I mean, schools for the most part are ending or have ended. So does that mean the person should be coming back to work? Well, it depends, which is a common HR response, by the way, right? It depends. But there's always situations to look at. So in this particular one, first I would ask if the employer is qualified under the Families First Act. So do they have under 500 employees, for example? And would that be possibly a situation where this person could qualify for EFMLA as part of that legislation, if that is accommodating? So can they, remotely work intermittently? Can they remotely work, still continue to remotely work? Do they need to take time off as a continuous leave of time? So there's a lot of questions, but it's not an automatic to say, oh, summer's here, that means they're not in school, they need to come back. Because think about, a lot of schools right now have canceled their camps, or if they had any like summer day programs, or if they had child care provider in general that was lined up for the summer that just now is not available at all because of COVID. That all are things that those are all things that need to be considered.
Well, no, I'm just going to jump in if you don't mind,
Oh,
because
yeah.
great comment here along with the question.
Yes.
Appreciated the point of having the one-on-one correspondence with the staff to specifically address concerns and get the understanding on an individual level. But should that conversation happen with an HR person or a supervisor first?
Yeah, that's great. I would say kind of depends on your comfort level with your managers, and how well you've communicated with them, that you feel comfortable that they are imparting the right message and the right tone that you want to share. If you're comfortable with that, then my personal opinion on that is that it's really great to come from the manager. And why? Because they work more closely, more often, and they're giving guidance and direction to the employee more so than HR is. So that's like a really important connection in my mind. But again, I kind of like to temper that, because sometimes, and I'm just kind of an honest person this way, but sometimes, our managers maybe don't say things as well as they should. And in that case, I kind of do want an HR person there to ensure that the right message is displayed.
Well, I would think too that HR is going to be more versed on all of the considerations where this is unusual. This is not things that a supervisor normally has to deal with. So we're kind of asking them to go above and beyond even the best of supervisors or managers.
Well, and actually, Melody, that's an excellent point, because as much as it's been difficult for HR to keep on top of all these things going on, can you imagine the managers? Yeah, it's like 10 times that. So that's a very good point.
We had some other questions on what suggestions do you have beyond an EAP for mental health? And then there was one that just came in that said the health insurance is offering free virtual mental health. Is that something that we should be doing?
Interesting. So I would say I'll take the second question first. I think yes, I would definitely take take up any opportunity you can find where there is a potential other resource, especially a telehealth kind of resource where again, the idea is to put as much support and as much resources in front of your employees so they feel like they've got someplace to go. The hard part, I think, in HR is that we tend to be, obviously very compassionate, but we tend to kind of want to fix things like a lot. And so we feel like maybe we can fix whatever's going on in employees' lives, and that just isn't our expertise, and where we have to be careful that we really should refer folks to mental health professionals that can assist them. And if by chance you don't have a strong EAP or an EAP at all, there are other resources like to look at your health benefit plans and programs. Sometimes even your brokers of various natures are going to have contacts to different resources that can help. But then there's also community resources that are available that are very open to having conversations with individuals so they don't feel like they're alone. So certainly those kinds of opportunities are one that I would encourage kind of doing some research and reaching out to, and again, tapping your kind of peer network group to see what they know and what they've been using, and offer some of those suggestions.
Great suggestions. What about just employee groups, fostering employee groups to share concerns with each other? Does that raise any red flags or other things we should be concerned with?
Yeah, I think overall, the aspect of sharing and communicating with one another, I think should be encouraged. So employers that have employees that want to come together, like in employee resource groups or business resource groups, whatever you want to call them, um, and want to talk. I mean, maybe they want to talk around a particular topic, or they want to talk sometimes around us how specific topic is affecting a certain dimension of diversity. I encourage all those kinds of activities, honestly. And those are ways in which we can hear more of the voice of the employee and what's on their mind. And I think it just is, should be carefully crafted so there's some kind of format for those, so that it's just kind of not a hodgepodge of like, well, just come and air your grievances and differences, and then everyone's just kind of talking over each other and who's the loudest. And so to have some kind of format where you're actually like, what is the purpose of us getting together? Is it just to kind of like, share what's kind of casually what's on our mind? It's like, well, you know, how is this going to benefit how your work here is done, or how we as an employer can help support you in your work, or how can we help our community, or how do we help our customer? Like some kind of focus related to how does it help the workforce, the customer, or even the community. And I think when you can kind of couch it that way, that's more directed, and you're going to get a lot more productive, constructive conversation out of just letting it, letting just the words fly.
I completely agree with that. To circle back to something you said earlier with the surveys, I think that's also a great way to get different voices and input from people who may not feel comfortable speaking up otherwise. But do you have examples of survey questions?
Yeah, well, first, great point that you're right. Some won't feel comfortable sharing, even when directly asked, and certainly maybe not in a group. So if you can provide something on paper, and maybe you do some kind of engagement survey anyway, but just kind of some questions that can be asked that they can confidentially and anonymously type back is good. And actually, when we get to the end, when I talk about some of the resources, I do have a sample like survey questions, or questions that can be asked just to kind of get you started. And again, you don't have to take it exactly word for word as is, but hopefully it's a starting point. And what I like to say, it kind of will inspire you to, maybe you'll think of like, ooh, I don't know if about that question, but I like this one better. So if that helps you, that'll be available for you to download, and you can use those as a starting point.
Perfect, because I know from the times we've done things internally or I've worked with clients on this, sometimes it's hard to anticipate everything. So at least having a starting point or some other things to consider is a huge help. So thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know, did you want to proceed? Or you want me to ask you a few more questions here?
Um, let's do a couple more questions, and then I can go on.
Okay, I have a couple related to vacation.
Mm.
If they are a work share plan where their employees are not working full time,
Mm.
what does it do to vacation accruals?
Well, so for that, I would say, I know this sounds like a standard like HR thing, but go back to your policy is really what I tend to start as a starting point, is like, what does it say? Now, sometimes when I suggest doing that, they'll go back to the policy and they'll say, it says nothing about that. And I'm like, well, so then let's decide how that can be interpreted when it doesn't specifically state how hours are accrued. Because if it's kind of like vague, well, then guess what? The employee is going to read it that way as well and feel as though, it should be interpreted a certain way. So usually I say, go back to your policy. What does it actually say? Follow that. If it's silent, then you're going to have to decide, I think, going forward, if you want to tighten up that language so that, it's clear. But here's my caveat with that, is just be careful that you don't tighten up that language to make it look like retaliation for their current situation and what's going on. So my suggestion, especially whenever you make a policy change, is to give as much advance notice as possible. So maybe you keep doing what you're doing today, but 90 days from now, you change that policy to say, okay, going forward, because then that gives people enough time to be like, okay, I understand it. I can ask questions about it. And then I can decide if I want to, still work for the organization if I don't want to comply with that policy, that kind of thing. So that would be my suggestion for that.
Awesome. Now, this is vacation from a little bit different, but you kind of touched on this at the very beginning. As employees are taking vacation time, what is it legal to ask them about where they're going or who they're with or what kind of circumstances that are potentially putting them at risk?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a tough one. I mean, the thing is, you can always ask. I mean, I shouldn't say that about just like a blanket policy, like you can always ask, but what I'm saying is that you have the ability to ask that, but they also have the ability to say, I'm not going to share that with you, because you're talking about their personal time. If it was work and work related, that's different, but this is personal time. So that's where you kind of get into the like, well, you could ask them, but I mean, they have every right to say, I'm not going to tell you, or I don't know, or they'll tell you someplace, that they haven't been, when in fact they've been someplace else. So it's tough. I go back to kind of the culture. Why are you asking the question anyway? And if you're asking it and explaining that your rationale of like, look, we just kind of want to know so that if you are in a place where there's a lot of people and it's a hotbed of activity, then we may ask you to self-quarantine when you come back. Or the whole idea is like, what as the employer, how are you doing your part to help mitigating the risk? And if you're asking that question for that purpose, then hopefully you can kind of create that narrative, or kind of create that business case for it. But again, they don't have to tell you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go back to some of the slides and the questions, but then we can certainly, so keep them coming. These are good. And then we can keep going with that. Okay, so here's one where we have an employee that is considered a high potential, meaning, good employee and doing a really, really great job. But now lately we've kind of noticed she's been showing up late to meetings, or just isn't really prepared, or, for calls like this is like turning off her camera. what, I'm not sure what's going on, or what do we do? And in those cases, that's where, as HR professionals, that just kind of like creates a little like, what's going on? Or even for a manager, like, this is not kind of the usual behavior that we've seen from her. All of those are actual indications that is something's going on, and that you should have a conversation to say, hey, what's up? I just kind of noticed this. It'd be no different than if you saw the person at work, in the hallway, with someone who always greeted you and, smiled and said hi every morning, and then all of a sudden stopped doing that. There's reasons behind it. So what are the reasons? Because certainly what you want to have happen in this situation is you want her to stay, you want to retain this good employee, but she's showing you signs and symptoms that something else is going on. And if we let that kind of just slide, it could end up being a situation where she ends up quitting, leaving, going on a leave of absence because whatever was going on with her in her life just wasn't able to be supported at that time, and it got worse and worse. So this is just one where I say, here's an opportunity for us to always be in tune with each other. And really, it's kind of like the taking care of each other concept of really asking and just being concerned, like, hey, what's going on? This isn't, how you normally are. And people will very much appreciate. Sometimes it's just a day of having a bad day, but sometimes it's something more. That way you can then, refer if needed to like an EAP or some other resource.
That's such an important thing, is to cue in, especially right now, to the signs that you're seeing in the workforce, and just even asking them the question. I have one related question regarding what it says in this particular question about turning off the camera. Can you require that employees turn on cameras during remote meetings?
You can. I mean, there's lots of times where employers will ask me like, well, can I do this? And I'll say, well, of course you can. However, you may run into it being illegal or this or this or that, like, but in cases of the camera, sure, you can ask that. You could say it's an expectation that we want to see you. So everybody has to be on camera. And again, recognize if someone says, nope, I'm not doing that. You can't tell me to do that. I've never done that before. I don't know why I'm doing that. It goes back to kind of the little sliver of thing I mentioned about managing change. Usually when people resist any kind of change, which that's a change, right? So if they resist it, it's like, well, why are they doing that? Do we not explain well enough, like why that's important? Did we not give them enough information? Did we not give them enough lead time to like accept and understand that and ask questions, et cetera, et cetera? So I always I'm like, let's ask why, like, let's figure out what's going on here, and then figure out, maybe it's just because they have a messy, they don't want anyone to see their face behind them, or maybe they haven't cut their hair, in 4 months. And so they're a little like nervous about that. But anyway, I don't want to sound flippant about that, because it could be another situation. And we just want to know so we can, work through it and figure out how to make that doable.
Great.
Okay, so overall, the last kind of hotline question I'll cover is like, as an organization, and this is what I've also heard, is like, how do we minimize overall kind of our liability as it relates to COVID? And while we're not legal professionals, and certainly, legal counsel is a very good and prepared resource to handle any kinds of specific liabilities for organizations, we certainly know best practices and things that will help you in cases related to what we have going on right now. And so a lot of these things we've mentioned already is putting together procedures and practices that are following CDC guidelines, making sure you're communicating and that the employees are understanding what to expect and what's expected of them. And then listening when they have concerns and requests to say, okay, what's going on here? How can we accommodate or be flexible? making sure that we're following all the other obligations we might have under various different laws, maybe ADA or EEOC, those kinds of things. So I think the best thing to do is have a plan and be prepared and communicate, and stay in constant communication with your employees. If you're doing that, you are minimizing your liability, because again, if someone comes to your organization and says, well, hey, there's a complaint, did you do X, Y, and Z? And you can say, yep, we did this on this day and this on this day, and here's the documentation of it, and here's how the person responded. And that's your best that's your best way of kind of mitigating as much as possible any risk that you might have.
Great. We have a very specific question here, and I know we have a number of co-ops on the line. So if you're willing to bear with me, I'm going to read the whole scenario so that you have the context.
Okay.
It's a grocery co-op designated as an essential business, and so most employees were able to stay on a regular schedule. They allowed their marketing person to work remotely because that could be accomplished with limited contact. But other roles, such as involving product or serving customers, stocking, replenishments, et cetera, had to be in person. One buyer, though, is still on self-quarantine with the self-reported guidance from a medical provider. Currently, she has used the FFCRA benefit. Given we have less than 50 full-time employees, if we continue keeping this person on unpaid leave, are we creating a dangerous precedent? Or should we devise a COVID-specific policy to address this?
Wow. Okay. That was great. That was a lot of detail. I think, there's always kind of this feeling that we have of like, if we change and do something different, are we setting precedent for like the rest of our lives having to be done a certain way? And I think a lot of times, especially in HR, that's why we couch a lot of our policies as like it may, because it gives us the opportunity to be flexible in our approach, and to know that every situation should be individually assessed. Because case by case, it's very difficult to have things like be exact same details. Yes, there can be similar details, but a lot of times it can be picked apart, so you're making the best business decision on what that current situation is. So, I mean, I guess in that situation, what's the risk of doing that? I mean, if I followed all of that, if you're following the obligations or the requirements of the FFCRA for this individual, that's great. I mean, I think that in terms of saying, well, gosh, does that mean that I have to keep doing that beyond when that particular legislation is effective? And the answer would be no. I mean, it's effective through the end of this year. I mean, and they could use up their time before then. So it would be, again, kind of reevaluate that situation. And if it's still working and it's can be accommodated, then I would say, yeah, keep doing that. And I realize like that situation might require a little bit more of like an actual conversation because of all the detail. But if you want to contact me just to kind of provide more, then I'd happy to talk to you about that.
I know it's a tough place. I mean, because some people, they can work remote, where a lot of them are essential and have to be in person. That's the only way to do their job. So it makes it tough when you don't even have the same options for your employees.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I know I've also heard for some, like manufacturing, for example. So some folks have been, working this whole entire time, while other, let's say, office individuals have been working from home. So now they're being called back to work. Maybe some are saying, "Ooh, I don't want to work. I'm not sure." And the individuals at work are saying, "Well, I've been here every day this whole entire time. Like, what are you talking about?" And then there's kind of a little bit of like tension. And so I'd say, for employers to really be cognizant of that kind of dynamic that could be going on. And if there is that kind of tension going on, to again, make sure you're talking to your employees And what are you doing for recognition of the folks that have been having to have that face-to-face contact over time? I know some employers decided to pay more or have been deciding to, when things, if things kind of normalize off, like give them a bonus or get, or like extra time off, or, just putting some plans in place to really recognize those that have been on the front line and having to really go to work with those concerns every single day.
You'll probably have this potentially as one of your resources as well, but another person wrote in that they have a person with a public health degree working on a master's who's volunteered as a part of that to give 240 hours, and they'd like to use that time to create a reopening plan and communications. Where do they start? How do they direct this person?
Okay, well, what's great is, yes, I think a lot of our resources might be able to help, but what we've also done on our resource page is try to link to different states, at least in the Midwest for sure, because we have a lot of employers in the Midwest, but each state I've found has come up with some really nice, well thought out considerations and reopen plans. Some are kind of set up as guidelines, some are set up like a checklist, but they're very detailed. And so we've got a lot of those links on our website to direct to say, you know what, you do not have to start from scratch. These are already there and available, and you can adapt them as you see fit. So that would be personally where I would go first, because I think they've done a good job.
Awesome, thank you. Just to remind everybody, we still have some extra time here because we did intentionally schedule this for longer than our normal hour period. So if you have additional questions, please go ahead and send them in, because I think we've addressed pretty much the questions that were submitted in advance, as well as the ones that have been submitted as we've gone along today.
Excellent. Well, and I think overall too, what I wanted to kind of wrap up and kind of show as kind of a way to wrap your head around, boy, if you could just give me kind of like 5 things I should be thinking about. Here's kind of what I put together as a thought of really kind of navigating, workforce recovery and bringing folks back, is really kind of assessing what the business need is. So, and that's going to vary department by department for sure. But really picking that apart, and it's not a one size fits all. It's each department. What do you need? How many people are needed? When are they needed? What's needed? Evaluate the employees that are coming back in, and recognizing that some might still be remote, some might not. Are you able to recall some from layoff and others not? And if you can't, bring everyone back at the same time, explain to them why, or explain to them the plan that you think is going to happen in the next 30 days, so that they're just not kind of waiting out there and wondering. So that goes back obviously to the communication piece and aspect. But when you're assessing your workplace, you're assessing safety first and foremost for all aspects of your work site, and communicating that return to work plan, or just that plan in general. Maybe they've already been at work, but what are you doing to ensure safety, not only for the next 30 days, but the next 6 months and 12 months and beyond? And really just measuring how people are feeling about what's going on and how they're able to do their work or not, or if they have some concerns about things going on personally, how can you help support them, or what kinds of policies or actions do you have that they can take advantage of, like let's say a leave of absence or something like that. So it's just kind of really, if I think about like these 5 things, I feel like I've hit on the big stuff. And then of course there's lots of details underneath, but at least that kind of gives you some kind of structure and framework for that. And like I mentioned too, so if you go to our particular website is mranet.org, but right away on the landing page, you'll see that we have made kind of easy access to our resources just right there. You can click on it. And once you do, you get this, like laundry list of all these great resources that are open to all. You don't have to be a member of MRA. We wanted to make this available to everyone just to help. I mean, we all are figuring this stuff out. So there's guides and sample letters and policies, and on the left hand side you'll see it's segmented by topic. So if it's a specific families first question or something about recovery, we just started, putting together kind of topics that we are hearing more and more members talking about and wanting to give resources. So whether that's the policy stuff, recruitment is starting to come up a little bit, or compensation questions, and engagement, obviously engagement.
That's
So
great, because
yeah,
actually a question came in here
yeah.
about salary, as you were saying that. They've heard about companies that are considering, like you said early on, what have we learned, changing to more remote positions, but in conjunction with that, then reducing salary because the employees don't have the same kind of costs for commuting and wardrobe, etc. What's your impression of that?
You before, like I'm really honest, transparent, kind of like HR professional. So in that particular situation, I would be a little bit concerned about that, just from the standpoint is, think about how you value a job. Okay, most job valuation methods are predicated on what are the responsibilities and skills needed and the value of that to the organization. And that's how you price jobs, and you market price as well to make sure you're competitive. So I'm guessing you don't kind of factor in like, ooh, I give them an extra $500 a year because, they have to dress a certain way. Maybe you do, but I would say even when I worked in banking, they didn't give us, and we had to be in three-piece suits and high heels and all that, but they did not give us any extra kind of pay to look good. So I would be cautious, because I think you're going to get, I mean, you could use that obviously as a reason, but you're going to get pushback, I guarantee you, from your employees saying, wait a second, I'm pretty sure that my salary is based off of the work that I'm doing, not, some kind of a stipend or something for a wardrobe or hair and makeup. So that's my thought on that.
Well, and from an accountant's standpoint, what I read into that is somewhat similar, that the value of the job and the salary is not based on where people are located per se. But if it's an employer who is struggling financially and looking for ways to be more effective and efficient, there's nothing wrong with doing that remote work, and you can reduce your time and space needs for an office. You could also, if you want them to bear more of the cost because the whole company is suffering somewhat, then don't pay for the remote access. There are ways to share cost if that was the intent too behind, some of this, because I know some organizations are really struggling to stay as viable entities, and employees are willing to somewhat pitch in on that cost sharing. But
Well, and that's a good point, because it goes back to the culture and I think how you communicate. So if you're saying, well, hey, we're trying to look at every single cost across the board, and if everybody kind of does a little piece, like maybe we can get to our goals. So that might mean, tightening our belts a little bit and scaling back on certain things that we normally would have done, but now we can't. That those kinds of explanations are going to make a lot more sense to employees, and they can wrap their head around that.
great. There's also some discussions about changing job descriptions to fit the current situation. One, should that happen just related to COVID? And if they do, and it's something, should it be a temporary job description, or do we put things in there for the future regarding social distancing, wearing masks, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because it does kind of speak to, how, is this going to be how it is like forever going forward, or is this truly temporary? And I feel like for a job description, or even a procedure that you have in place, definitely change it to what your current reality is now so that it is the most relevant and realistic to what's happening, but then also have the ability, say at year end or say mid 2021, to say we have this way now, but we'll reevaluate and see if we'll make a change to it. And you can make a change to that. I mean, it's actually what you should be doing every time you kind of analyze a job or refill a position. You should be always checking to make sure if that's really what you need, and if the job description really syncs up to that.
It was interesting when I read that because I thought of the job descriptions that talk about, how many pounds you have to lift or some of the things you have to be able to do. I mean, here's another thing that may change going forward to address whether it's an essential job where you have to be in person and you have to have personal protective equipment or not. I mean, it may just become part of the norm going forward.
Yeah, great point.
Are employees able to reimburse for reorganization of home space and computer access, internet, et cetera? And are there any limitations to make sure that it's equitable?
Yeah, so employers can always be more generous than what a law tells you to do. And unless you have a state law that tells you that you need to reimburse for business expenses at home, like I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, Illinois, is a state that would require that, but not all states do. So you just have to be careful of like what your state or, you know, local might require. But overall, I mean, you have the ability, the flexibility to reimburse how you want to reimburse for those kinds of expenses. And yeah, so you certainly can do that. I would say you would want to make sure you're consistent and fair in your process in terms of like how much you're giving individuals, because if there's disparity, they'll eventually find out that disparity, and they're going to ask you about that and say, why does this person get this and I get this? So you're going to have to be prepared to answer that. But in terms of, those kinds of expenses to make the homework environment more conducive to being able to be the most productive, that's something I definitely encourage, especially if it's going to be longer term. You want them to be comfortable. I would want them to be kind of ergonomically feeling. I don't know about you, but man, working at my kitchen table, I mean, my neck and my back, like that is not set up to be sitting for 8 hours. So I'm just like, okay, I'm not in my kitchen today, but it's like, so yeah, if it's going to be more of a permanent, or I shouldn't say permanent, long-term situation, ensuring that they have what they need to comfortably work and be productive at it.
Here's another one here. What's the difference between a leave of absence and a furlough in terms of employer obligation?
Yeah, that's a great one too, because there oftentimes are used interchangeably, I think. But a furlough kind of was, I think, that terminology kind of came more from government. If you ever heard of like government furloughs, it was basically a set period of time that you knew you were going to be off. It was like a week or 2 weeks, and you were not going to be working. So the intent of a furlough is that you're going to come back. Like it's not meant to be like, oh, we're not sure if you're coming back. No, a furlough is meant to be short term and you're coming back. And so some people will still use that term, and I think that's fine to use, but interchangeably with the term leave of absence, I mean, technically it is a leave of absence from your work, but layoffs and leaves of absences could be more kind of open-ended of like, oh, I'm not sure how long this will last. I'm not sure if we're coming back, not sure if the situation is going to change. Where if you're going to implement a furlough, in your mind, they're coming back. You just need to do some cost saving measures for like a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time, that kind of thing.
Great. I so appreciate all the time and effort you've put into this and giving us your viewpoints. I do not have any pending questions at the moment. If somebody has something that they'd really like to ask, please go ahead and type it in or raise your hand and Emily can give you voice privileges too at this point. As I'm talking, one did come in. What about responsibility to pay and unemployment when you have somebody on leave? And from an accounting standpoint, I can't help but throw my 2 cents worth in here about the unemployment and reemployment issue. In some cases, I know some of our clients have been, the response to is, you can come back to work. Well, I don't want to because unemployment's better. They have to be aware that there is a potential fraud issue there, because if you are offered a viable position and you turn it down, you have violated the terms of most states' unemployment requirements. So,
Excellent point. And I would also say too that, I mean, from an employer standpoint, if that happens and they say, nope, I'm staying off, I'm, making more, then I would want them to get that offer in writing, get their refusal in writing, and they don't have to necessarily sign off on it, but you need to document that they, verbally refused or whatever it is, because then you can also have that as documentation. Also, if you applied, and I'm not a PPP expert by any means, but if you did apply for that, I know that's a factor they look at to say they're not going to count that against you. If you offered and the person said, no, I'm not coming back. Well, you made the offer, you have work, they just chose, now it becomes their choice not to work, but you have it available for them. So that's just, those are all important considerations.
is there a difference in an employer's responsibility to pay for a furlough versus a leave of absence?
Well, only if, again, if you have an existing policy, I'd go back and say, like, what are your existing policy practices? And then I would look at the law. So if you have to, or if the employee is eligible and you as an employer are eligible for Families First and you meet all the criteria, well then, yeah, then that's a paid, for the most part, that's, a paid kind of concept for that leave. So it's really up to the employer. Some I've seen will say, well, you have already accrued PTO, so I'm going to require that you take that. Some will say, well, you have a personal leave of absence you can take, but our policy says it's unpaid. So there's like so many, a variety of different ways that that you can follow, but in terms of your requirement to pay, it's what your policy says or what a law tells you you have to do.
Perfect. Is there anything that we should be documenting or doing specifically for employees not coming back to employment because of COVID, personal reasons, et cetera, but in conjunction with the current status of the work environment?
Well, I'm a big proponent of documentation. Did I mention that before?
So
So
am I.
I say yes. I say document yes. Every reason, no reason, so that not only so you have that in case the question comes up, but also so you can remember what the situation was. I mean, every day, I'm sure I don't even remember what I did yesterday. So I want to have that so I don't forget that's why things transpired the way they did, so yes.
Awesome. Another one has added that they have hazard pay, and I love this. They're calling it essential community service compensation for a more positive vibe. But what's the process for discontinuing that additional pay?
Yeah, so that's a great question that has come up. When should that end? When does it feel right to end that? And that's a tough one because it is an individual company decision. And I think you just want to carefully craft how you describe your rationale for that. If it is because the situation has lessened the risk, then say that. Or if it's because financially we just can't extend that any longer, like, be honest, be transparent. I'm a big proponent of that as well. So just tell them exactly why. But if you can extend it, extend it. I think it's a really, really great way of showing recognition, and I really like the way you worded it.
Yeah, me too. And just this is more on a personal note, but I know from some of the clients that I've been working with too, to reemphasize Linnell's point, communicate clearly, because in some cases, what employees are hearing is, here's what I have to sacrifice, but what are you as management and or leaders or owners sacrificing? And you don't have to be specific in dollars or anything else, but they need to know that it's a collaborative effort.
They really do want to know. Yeah, they really do want to know that we're kind of all in this together. So I definitely, yeah, definitely agree with that.
Well, I so appreciate your time, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Emily for her wrap up. And thank you all for attending and putting your questions in as we went along.
Yes, thank you both so much, Melody and Linnell. This was absolutely fantastic and so much good information. Just a reminder that we'll be sending out the recording of today's webinar and the PowerPoint presentation to all the attendees, so keep a lookout in your email for that. Ladies, do you have any other last minute comments?
I think the last thing I'd want to say is just, keep doing the good work you're doing. I know oftentimes if many of you are HR folks on the phone, not a lot of times we get asked, how are we doing? We do a lot of the asking, like, how is everyone else doing? So I just want to tell you, you are appreciated for everything that you're doing, because you are doing a lot. And I personally have heard it and felt it. And so keep doing the good work and asking questions, and we are all in this together.
Awesome. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, Melody. Thanks, Linnell.
Thank you.